Oh, hello and hi to all of my friends and all of my followers, all 8 of my subscribers. I think I'm recording this also, obviously, for those who will subscribe in the future, and maybe they'll get at least a picture of where I'm at this point, at this transitional place when I am sort of shifting from the private sphere to the public sphere. And what I've been trying to do is to keep things really simple and to begin with the basics, and I'm a big fan of basic fundamental ideas, fundamental questions, fundamental texts, fundamental shifts in the way that we see the world. And one of those ideas that is more fundamental than most is the idea of self-education. That's an idea that has propelled my sort of churning of ideas and questions over the years. The context within which I've been doing what I do is shaped by the idea of self-education. And I didn't really think about it until I started seeing that there were a lot of videos made about self-education. So I thought I would throw my 2 cents in, because on the one hand, it's such a broad subject that it almost goes without saying. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things that can be said. And in fact, if you listen to what I say, I think I have a few things that might actually be very unique. And when I begin with the question of self-education, I begin with sort of like where I was at when I was, let's say, 16 years old. And I had begun realizing that on my own, I could pursue knowledge, that I could read books and try to understand the world in my own way. And I bracket that under self-education, but there are a lot of different ways of thinking about it. Like, obviously, there's the idea of the autodidact. There's an autodidactic quality to thinking and learning on your own. And I think that that's something that, to me, as a teenager, was a gift, because it freed me in many ways from the control of other people's ideas and methodologies. In other words, I had my own sort of intimations regarding what it was that I wanted to pursue and what it is that I wanted to think about, without even really realizing that those were my thoughts. I'm sort of projecting what I realize now onto then, because at the time it was an experience of rupture. It was the experience of great joy, and I mean that when I was a teenager, to be quite honest, I had never really paid attention in school before that, or really thought about learning in any kind of positive way. And I think what had dawned on me at that age was that there was a kind of power to be had with knowledge, with knowing things. And I guess on a certain level, that had to do with being able to outsmart people or to know things that they didn't know. And on a certain level, I think that might have something to do with it. And on the other hand, there was a kind of thing within me that it tickled, which I later began to realize was the will to truth. In other words, I gained a kind of power through understanding and knowledge, and I also learned how to do things. I learned that I could learn skills on my own, by thinking on my own, by reading books on my own. But I also found that over time, not everybody who was self-educating themselves, let's say, were really interested in the truth, in the sense in which there wasn't within them what I just assumed that everyone else had, which was this desire to know the truth in itself. In other words, to know what the truth is, regardless of how I wanted to feel about it or what I wanted the truth to be. And I had sort of assumed that would be at like the heart of my questioning and my underlying reading and my underlying thinking and my underlying drive ultimately to write. But again, these are thoughts that came later, because on a certain level, what I can see now is that that wasn't other people's pursuits. And so self-education on a certain general level means like self-education in the sense that one is continuing their education after school. And there are a lot of people, obviously, who sort of are lifelong learners because they found that joy that comes with always discovering new things and learning new things. And there's also a sense in which there's a practicality to it, because the more that you learn, the more skills that you have, the better person you become. And so a lot of people pursue that without degrees, without going to school. So there's a sense in which self-education is, as I said at the beginning, so general that it almost sort of goes without saying. Look at that sunset. See, that's my mythology. That burning sun. Let it burn the fat in your soul. But no, so self-education, as it is for many other people, has to do with learning skills, learning crafts, learning things that give you a certain immediate outcome. And that's quite obvious. And there's a sense in which a lot of people think of it as reading books. They buy a book and then they read it. They might even read it actively with a pen, or maybe even take notes and use that as sort of a basis for a kind of self-education. And it's a powerful, beautiful experience in itself, but it's also empowering in the sense in which, as I mentioned earlier, there's a sense in which you yourself are empowered in this activity. But I think that what's often desiring in those who are pursuing self-education, whether it's learning a craft, learning how to weld, or learning how to watching YouTube videos and learning how to talk to people, there's sort of a desire for there to be some kind of connection between that and other skills. In other words, there's often a desire to have a more systematic approach to their self-education. And so one might read a book or even take on a systematic project of thinking clearly about a certain subject. And that in itself is a kind of self-education, and it's radical in what it can do, especially if that person is sort of pursuing questions that no one else is asking and producing outcomes through their learning that no one else is doing. I mean, that's quite miraculous. So you can see that these are just a few of the many, many different ways that self-education can happen. And so it sort of depends on the broad ways in which education itself can happen. And what I'm getting at is my own unique view of what self-education is. And I've used that word 100 times, but that's just because I'm not trying to use a bunch of different words to describe what is in fact a broad, more intimate, more fundamental sense in which what one is becoming is an opening. Your mind is opening as much as your body, in the sense that you're absorbing the world as it is. I think what's at the heart of self-education in many ways is shattering your narrow views of the world, your provincial, parochial vision of things that is often centered in where you come from or what you've been taught. The ultimate underlying aim of self-education on a certain level is to shatter that mindset, so as to free your mind. And so you could say that self-education on the one hand is to free the body by giving you the power that might give you the money, that might give you the leisure. But on a certain level, if you're not free in your mind, what is the point in even being free economically, And so what does it mean to be free in your mind? I think that there's a relationship that is very strong between a real self-education and the kind of freedom of mind that is sometimes thought of as being something like a change in the soul, traditionally in theology or in Buddhism and metaphysical traditions. There's a sense in which it's seen as a kind of flip that one can do over time or can take over time. And like I said, that flip in the more Western traditions conceives of it as a kind of breaking up of the subjective, egocentric, perspective that you have, or breaking up the ideas that you have that really cannot be rationally justified or rationally explained or defended or therefore believed. And so I think that there's a sense in which what I'm trying to do is to open up from a broadest perspective possible, and then trying to narrow in down to what it is that we can think of as being this broad thing called self-education. And I think that when I'm stepping back once again, as I did earlier, to describe in the most common way what self-education can mean, another broad thing that has to be said is that it means that you're thinking outside of institutions, because there's a lot of really great things to be had from being within a certain kind of world, whether it's academic or corporate. And if you live in a world of libraries and a world of teachers, and your education is taught in the form of a curriculum, that is quite amazing. And it can work extremely well for people that it works for. And so there's a certain sense that it's not a moral thing. It's really, you know what I mean? Like, it's really just about seeing that it can really work for a lot of people, because, the institutions that sustain our lives are made up of a lot of people who are really thriving. And so the question is, are you thriving? Because although I don't have resentment towards, here I am walking by a college right now. That's funny. I'm like trying to make sure that I'm recording it. You can see that it's a wonderful thing, and that on a certain level, what colleges and institutions are doing on the deepest level is that practice of helping you to let go of, or let dissolve what is only a result of your own bias and your own opinion, but is not in fact objectively true. So in a certain deeper sense, what colleges are doing is taking the students and breaking up what is wrong in them, and on a certain level correcting it. So it has a certain managerial power, colleges. And I mean that in a devil's advocate kind of way, I guess, to defend it as being something that is very conducive to producing the world that allows people like me to even exist. So philosophically, I like to defend things that I don't really even agree with. And what I mean by not agreeing isn't really that I don't believe whatever there would be to believe about it, but that I recognized early on that I personally did not fit into the institutions of education. And in a certain level, I really wanted so bad to be a part of that world. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to get degrees. And I wanted to make original contributions. And I set myself up for that in terms of intention. But I had to ultimately really just accept on many different levels that I was not that kind of person, and that it wasn't that there was something wrong with that world. It's really just that some of us work in different ways. And so I ended up outside of these institutions. And what I discovered later on, after all the pain and difficulty of realizing that I was on my own, and, for instance, having to work regular jobs, quote unquote, as opposed to having a comfortable place in college life or even within a corporate world, because this doesn't mean really just academia. It also means like the institutions that are all around us in churches and in communities and in workplaces and in ways of living. And on a certain level, what's really radical is the idea that a person even thinks they can live outside of institutions, or that they would want to live outside of institutions. And so I think that if one does that, you'll be destroyed if you're passive about it. And a lot of people are already outside of institutions. But the only power that we have is in activating our autonomous ability to see what is in front of us and to make choices that can really take advantage of the options that we have, so that our thinking can really honor creative thinking, in the sense that we can creatively make use of facts and parts of our life that we don't really want to accept on a certain psychological level, but we know that we have to because we're honest with ourselves. And I think that self-education is a part of that political immediacy of salvaging a life from the wreckage of wrecked institutions that on a certain level held us for so long. And the broader a perspective you get, the easier it is, I think, to see what I'm saying, because a lot of what I'm saying is an outcome of a certain education that people get from colleges that I got on my own. And a part of that education that you could get either in a college or on your own is the ability to think in a super big sense. Not that it's anything to do with reality or real, but you have to know something about history, and not just your own history, and not just other people's history, but something about geological time, something about cosmological time. In other words, the size of the universe. You have to have not just knowledge of the size of the universe. A part of self-education is having that feeling in your bones regarding the immensity of time, which expands beyond you in ways that our synapses cannot even keep track of. And so I think that there's a sense in which it's not merely information that we're taking in. It's also a sense of orientation, so we can triangulate ourselves and see ourselves in space and time. Now, of course, if you're skeptical like I am, you can see that nobody has any vision outside of themselves. In other words, nobody has a vision of the whole, of totality of the cosmos. So it's always a construction, like the cosmos itself, like your idea of history, no matter how objective you think that you're being, and I think you can be objective about history, but there is a sense in which you're always working within a certain limitation. And so I think that that itself, though, is precisely a continuation of the very thing that it's critiquing. In other words, there's a sense of irony that has to be involved in self-education. And that irony means that, I guess, you sort of discover things that are possible but not true. And what I mean is that there's a certain horizon that you meet in many different ways, and how you respond to that horizon really defines you. And so self-education to me has meant wanting to open myself up to the immensity of everything and take in as much as I can. And I had developed a kind of deep curiosity about everything that led me to keeping a notebook, that led me to actively pay attention. And I think that that has been sort of like a enabling activity within me, in that it's enabled my consciousness to pay attention, in a sense in which self-education ultimately really is about amplifying our capacity to pay attention in a critical, creative, imaginative, realistic way. And so in a certain level, it's ironic that the very pinnacle of education, at its very highest level of what that might even mean, is in fact allowing a person to see what is right in front of them. And I know that sounds absurd, but it is in fact the crowning jewel of deep education. Deep education in the sense in which one is not merely trying to learn a skill, but one is attempting to think about who one is within a situation in which there is little time to think, and there's an urgency, a push and a pressure of life that's asking us to answer these questions with our lives. Like, that's the style that we're coming at this with. And so what is self-education when you're limited in time, when you don't have time, when there are decisions that have to be lived through? Like, there's a certain retroactive quality to philosophy, because you're always thinking backwards and thinking through, and yet you're also confronting situations that demand an original kind of thinking. So self-education demands a lifelong learning that is really not about learning, and it's not really about education. It's about keeping your mental cognitive state in a state of readiness on an intellectual level, but also an imaginative and an emotional level. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but that's a part of what Circle 8 is about, is ultimately exploring this kind of question in a way that is really allowing itself to follow its own tail, so that I can follow my own tails and ultimately discover what I didn't know I thought until I sort of said it. And I think that has something to do with having read earlier today. You know, I spend a few hours every day reading, and I'm also writing. And I'm writing right now a number of articles about things that I have been doing my whole adult life. And one of those things is keeping a notebook and reading, always asking questions, but also testing what I think I know, testing what I think I've learned by seeing self-education as a form of self-questioning, that it isn't merely about attaining knowledge in a positivistic sense, but it's also about destroying knowledge within yourself that isn't true. And that's something that other people allow us to do. So participating in other people is a part of this self-educative process. And I'm just wondering how long I could possibly talk about this subject, because I could go on and on, but I think I'm going to end it here so that I don't go on for 30 minutes like I did in the last video I recorded. That is far longer than I imagined I would, you know. So I guess this is sort of like an opening shot in regards to like me talking to myself about what it is that is so important to me, and attempting to be clear and accessible so that others can give me feedback, and so that I can sort of like continue this process of self-educating myself, ultimately as a way of building bridges and connections with other people. So I hope you have a good night. It's a beautiful night here, and I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8.